It's a Tuesday afternoon and your best engineer says to you, I need to talk. You say, sure, thinking it's about the upcoming project timelines. He closes the door, sits down and says, hey, I've accepted an offer. I'm leaving and my last day will be 2 weeks from Friday. At that point, as a manager, your heart sinks. You don't know what to do. You're actually confused. They were fine at the all hands the previous week, and also you had a good review of them a few months ago. But now everything doesn't align, and you just don't know what you don't know. I'm Joseph from Career Movement, and today we're going to talk about the signals that happen before the resignation and what managers can look for throughout somebody's employment. So this really isn't rare. It's more of the normal, right? When somebody puts in a notice. Now, I want to share something that, I don't have all the stats, but Gallup fortunately does for us. And in a recent workplace research that they did, 51% of employees are actively or passively looking for new jobs. And 32% of managers believe their top performers would leave. So there's a 19-point gap between what is actual reality versus what management thinks is going on within their office walls. So this happens all the time. And there's a real cost of all of this. When a senior technical employee leaves, according to SHRM, they show that a replacement cost is typically 150% to 200% of that person's annual salary when you factor in recruiting and hiring costs, onboarding and training, lost productivity during the gap, institutional knowledge that walks out that door, and the impact it has on team morale and the remaining workload that falls on them. So for a $150,000 software engineer or controller, you're looking at a $275,000 to $375,000 impact for the company. And that's if you replace them very quickly. So replacing them is one thing, but let's go back to, 6 months prior, and I'm going to highlight that using 3 different people and their stories. The first is going to be Alex. He's a software engineer, senior level, has been with this company for 4+ years in a mid-sized company, 250 or so employees. He's full stack and works on the main core product team. He's a solid performer, has never had any issues with management, is actually the manager's right-hand person. Then we have Sarah, who's a finance manager at a private equity-backed company. They're in the SaaS space, 3+ years at her role. She was recently promoted. She always exceeds expectations. And then we have Jamie, who's in a Series C company. She's a controller, manages a team of 4, oversees all financial reporting and compliance for the company. All 3 of them resigned. All managers didn't really see it coming. All had been there for a while and had been sending signals that they were not happy. So we're going to start with the boredom period, or that's what I call it at least, but it's 6 months before somebody puts in a resignation. And going back to Alex, he started finishing his tickets quicker than normal. He stopped volunteering for the stuff that was interesting to him, which everybody knew was more of the architectural problems. In his one-on-ones, said everything's fine, just kept his head down, focused on the sprint. They used to propose new ideas, but no longer cared to do so, or at least not to the level that they used to. And, it just felt like more of maintenance and refactoring kind of AI written code was what, he was focusing on. And what the manager missed at that point, 6 months early, is when he stopped innovating and caring about the stuff that he usually was interested in. That's when they're starting to check out, AKA starting to be bored in terms of their actual job. And then as we move on to Sarah, she started delegating some of her favorite projects to her own team. She used to be first to volunteer for cross-functional work across and initiatives across the company. Now, most of the time, she says she's swamped when, others ask her to do some pricing reviews in the committee. She's just too busy. So her manager actually thought, hey, this is great. You're finally delegating some things, so you have a little bit more time. But what was happening is she was just preparing her team to not necessarily need her anymore. And then lastly, we go to Jamie, where, she stopped attending the optional finance leadership meetings and roundtables because all her strategies that she had tried to implement or at least talk about were just being pushed down the line. She used to be active in the CFO's strategic planning sessions. Now they were more on autopilot mode, concentrating on managing the technical accounting teams. So her manager and just thought, hey, finally she's concentrating on what she has to concentrate instead of kind of coloring a little bit outside the lines. So that's why she just didn't care as much anymore about putting herself in those shoes. So, when high performers are really, starting to check out, doing the minimum, even if they're doing it well, especially if they're, obviously doing it well, that's obviously key because that will be a non-sign essentially, but that's not necessarily maturity. That's more of the disengagement that happens. And most managers miss this because the work is still being done. It's still being done to a high level, but it's certain things that happen for certain people at certain times where they do start to check out a little bit. Even just a couple percentage points is huge. And maybe the executive level, when referencing Jamie and Sarah, just missed some of the strategic things that they were looking for, as they continued in their career progression. So we move on from the boredom stage to now the permission slip. And this is 4 or 5 months before they're actually putting in their notice. And the way that it really works is just something happens psychologically in their head where they now have freedom to at least listen to conversations or to look. For Alex specifically, the way that this happened is he ended up going to a dinner with a former colleague. Former colleague does similar work at a new company. They're actually building and developing new features and products. And Alex, obviously felt that he was more in that maintenance, legacy kind of mode. And that really showed him, okay, there's something more interesting out there. He also found out through that colleague that colleague was making more money. Alex also hadn't had a, comp review in, over a year. And everything was always delayed in terms of his comp reviews. We'll do it once we hit, XYZ target. So once he had that dinner, he started Googling, and saying, hey, what am I actually worth? And he found out that he was 20% below market for his skill set. So it wasn't that he was unhappy per se. The work was fine. The team was fine. He liked his manager, liked his colleagues, but understanding that there's a 20% gap in his head was what triggered that permission slip for him to actually be open to new opportunities. Then we kind of just move on to Sarah. Sarah, at our company, they essentially announced a record-breaking quarter. Leadership understood, that growth was incredible during that time period. They were celebrating that growth. Her finance team, they were putting in 70-hour weeks just to kind of stay afloat, for that entire quarter, really, to close books and support the growth and prepare investor reports. Sales got a huge commission. They got a huge, trip in terms of President's Club and so forth. But, her finance team didn't get any acknowledgement, from the C-suite. It just looked to her that they were just there more for operational, support than anything else. And she didn't feel appreciated in terms of what her team was able to do during that time. And lastly, Jamie, during their annual quarter, board prep, she realized that the company had gone ahead and greenlit a couple hires in different departments, but wouldn't approve a backfill for her team, from a few months ago. It had been over a quarter. She felt her team was drowning a little bit, and they had put in longer hours as well, but no recognition. She had raised it a couple times to management, but still got the no and the red flag to say you're not able to hire. So when that other department was able to move forward with hires, it gave her that permission slip to go ahead and understand, hey, maybe I'm not aligned exactly with my company for whatever, case may be. Obviously, this one was workflow and how much time she was putting in. So that really gave her the thought process of, hey, is the grass greener on the other side? So now we're moving on to basically, 3 months before resignation, and the mentality has changed, right? Something inside that part of that loyalty to that company has wavered a little bit in their head. So you can't really see it, but this is where pattern and behavior starts actually changing in the workplace, where now they're going to start crossing their T's, dotting their I's, in terms of documenting and just giving more knowledge to others so they can get rid of the guilt if they were ever to leave, right? So now Alex, what he ended up doing is he started documenting his work, more thoroughly, created comprehensive documentation for the systems he particularly built so he could transfer that knowledge over to the next engineer. They updated their code comments more frequently. They organized the repo structure. So again, management thinks, oh, they're really stepping up. They're really cleaning up what they're doing. But it's really Alex in his head, he was really just building that transition plan. And Sarah, she volunteers to train her team on her responsibilities, not on something specifically that her team, a member or something is lacking. It's more on her specific duties, and wants it to be so there's no redundancy. But really, again, what she's trying to do is really just knowledge transfer her skill set to let go of that guilt. And her CFO is thinking, great, she's finally helping, her direct reports do things for the first time from a higher level standpoint, and things she's, bringing that leadership skill up. And for Jamie, she was creating detailed processes for their month end and how they were able to shorten the time period for that, as well as training the senior accountant on more controller duties. Again, going back to, hey, I'm going to replace myself with somebody in my team type mentality. So developing, the team skill sets for that eventual transition is really what's going on in their head. And when somebody suddenly becomes generous with their knowledge, especially if they've previously been, against it, that's a time when management really needs to pay attention, because at that point, they're not necessarily being a team player, although on the outside it looks like it, but they're just clearing their conscience. So now we're, month 5, 2 months before their actual resignation, and this is what I call just the complacement stage. They essentially are okay with anything, right? So for Alex, at this point, they stop engaging in technical debates they used to. They are deferring to any decision somebody makes, saying whatever you think is best, sure, we'll go for it. And, they no longer have the strong opinions that they used to. Alex specifically was on architecture, and they stopped going to social outings. but they do feel less stressed. They feel a little bit lighter. They're just in this mode of, hey, it is what it is. Sarah, for her specifically, she was, she didn't necessarily care about the next year's budget planning, said, hey, I'll do whatever you guys need me to do. She used to have really strong ideas about the strategy for, moving the next year, like every year prior to that. Now she's just in execution mode. And for Jamie, she stopped, caring so much about what was going on and just started not implementing any new financial controls. Basically said, hey, we'll just do we'll keep the status quo. That's been working. There's no necessarily point to create something new, especially if they've already kind of checked out. She no longer wanted to have fights, about what the right approach was in terms of hiring and the workload for her particular team. So, it wasn't vocal about it anymore and just documented the processes. So the next controller, whether it was somebody that was going to get moved up or came from external, was ready to go. So it's kind of the weirdest stage actually within, the search process in a way, because they're not necessarily angry with the company. They're not complaining, but they're just not fighting anymore. They're just at peace with being complacent with what's going on in the office. And if you're not paying attention to it, you think, great, they're just chilled out, they're not so intense anymore. But that piece is really just giving you another sign that says, I don't care as much anymore. You've kind of just broken me down enough emotionally where I am already resigned. And that's when they really make their decision to walk out that door. They just haven't told you the words, I resigned, or my last day is XYZ. But the fights were good for them before and are no longer valuable to them in their current mentality. So they're ready to actually walk out that door without any fight anymore. And that's really the complacement period. So we move on from that to the last month before they put in their resignation. And at this point, obviously, they're interviewing in the background. You just don't know it. And this is at the point where, all the weight is really off their shoulders. They've already accepted the fact that they're leaving. It's just a matter of when. And, Alex, his engineering manager, kept rescheduling their one-on-ones. Alex was no problem. He didn't care, to be honest, that they were being rescheduled. But in the beginning of his tenure there, he would have been incredibly mad about this and frustrated. But now he just doesn't care enough. It's actually more of a relief because he doesn't have to, quote unquote, fake something, in terms of his attitude towards, the job anymore. And so he was ready to go. The weight was completely off his shoulders, as I call kind of this time period. For Sarah, at that point, she was casual in her one-on-ones, had brought up some things with her CFO, hey, I want to, move towards that CFO track, would still get, that passive answer, yes, we'll talk about it down the line type of thing. And she was, at that point, she was checked out as she was interviewing for, CFO roles, but wanted to see if there was even a hint that, the company cared about her kind of thoughts and her goals. But she never brought it up again, so, her management obviously thought that they were just kind of delaying away or talking about it, and they had addressed it at the moment and would address it in the future. But to her, it was, her another sign for her to walk out that door. And for Jamie, her CFO really just asked her what was going on, if she needed help on anything. And honestly, Jamie said, no, I'm just doing what the plan is and chucking along kind of thing. Again, the weight is off, the stress is off. She didn't care to work the long hours anymore. CFO thinks, everything's great because she didn't, bring up any challenges, and at that point she was already out that door, already saying like, it doesn't matter what I say, you're not going to listen. You've had years to try to, look at this, but I'm just beating the dead horse at this point. So again, that weight is fully off for, all three people. And in all of their cases, there was a certain moment that happened where they did test and check with leadership, if they were paying attention to their needs, professionally, and whether their concerns mattered. And obviously there's times where that aligns perfectly in the time frame with a company, and sometimes it doesn't. But when a candidate or, obviously an employee at this point feels that there's a misalignment, that honestly is really what can drive somebody to say, maybe I'm not a priority here. Why am I making you a priority in my life? And really that's the MO and that final checkbox to really just say yes to any offer that comes in for them. So we finally reached it. We reached the resignation. All three said some sort of, hey, I'm leaving for career growth, right? Everybody's heard it, but nobody knows what that means for any individual per se, unless you really get into the specifics. And their exit interviews were very generalized. They literally just said just some different opportunities that they wanted to work on. But what they tell me is completely different. For Alex, he specifically said, I've been doing the same thing for the last 18 months. I have not worked on anything, that is forward, progression in terms of what we're doing. We're not really designing anything new. They're asking me to use AI, but now I'm spending more time cleaning up the AI code than if I were to just write it. So at that point, it's just not something for them. Sarah had asked for promotion 3 different times during different one-on-ones. Each time she got, let's revisit later, type, answer. And, after 18 months, you just stop believing things. And once they got that permission slip, they were really kind of, moving forward. Jamie, on the other hand, she just felt she was underwater for too long of a period. And none of her concerns were addressed at all, whether, it was a workflow thing, whether it was a compensation and a product thing for Alex, whether it was a career path and skill set type thing for Sarah. All three, were feeling that they had reached their career ceilings basically at their companies for different misalignments. And, it's not that any of them had a bad relationship with a manager, but it just emphasized that there's something else that was missing that they really needed to look at. And it's not necessarily some of those things that you see right in front of you, but there are signs, right? And we've gone through those signs at this point, but I do want to highlight a couple things for everybody that is going to give you a framework to move forward as you look at your personnel. So here it is, managers, pay attention closely right now because this is really for you if you've made it this far. But right now, we're going to talk about the 7 signals that top performers are showing you if they are checking out. We're going to start with number 1, calendar and availability change. When there's more focus blocks on their calendars, they're less readily available for your last minute meeting. When they're just less flexible overall, they're doing more work from home days. If you are in that hybrid schedule, at that point, you should not accuse them of anything, but you should notice it. You should ask about it and check in. Hey, like what's going on? Because that is your first sign that they are fully checking out. Number 2, the engagement drop in future strategy for the company, right? They stop volunteering for the new projects. they're disengaged in roadmaps or strategy discussions. Whatever you think is more the common answer that you get from them, and they are in full deferral mode, at that point, they're checking out. So ask directly, you seem less engaged, what is going on, right? It could be about a particular project, it could be overall, but those are the conversations you need to have as a manager. Then we go to step number 3, over documentation. Suddenly there's guides in place that nobody asked for. They're organizing files, they're detailing handoff documents to other people. They're making their work replaceable and easy to understand for others. So at this late stage, really need to prompt knowledge sharing questions and pushing them a little bit to truly understand some of the reasons why that's happening. This is a big one. So get information from them of why they're doing this and see if there's an actual reason that makes sense or whether they're just doing it to do it, where that is literally the next progression for them is to just hand it off. Number 4, we're going to move to the behavior changes in one-on-ones. At this point, meetings are going to be shorter. They're surface level only. They stop bringing up concerns or ideas. They just nod their head. At that point, you're going to have to change your questions, and we'll cover this in a little bit of how you're able to really understand the behavioral changes during those one-on-ones. But you have to, at first, understand what's going on and acknowledge that that is truly happening. Number 5, compensation or growth conversation shutdowns. If you as a manager are not open to what they are saying regarding their compensation or their career track, they might mention, a market rate, a career path that they're thinking about or have thought about, a class that they're taking or are interested in taking, and you give really vague answers to any of those concerns. At that point, it's not a time where you should never bring it up and just let them seep in it. At that point, you really have to address it. You have to talk it out. You have to align yourself with that person at that time to understand, okay, if it is a career path, is it a skill set? What are the things that they need to work on to get them there? Are they fully blocked off? Is that possibility not there? Same thing with compensation, what are the metrics that they need to hit to get to the level that they want or something higher? But you do have to align, and those conversations have to be incredibly honest and upfront, because otherwise there are going to be just absolute resentment from one side for the other. Then we're going to go ahead and move to the social withdrawal, which is step number 6. At this point, they don't care to join the team for lunches or social outings that they used to go to and talk to. They're less conversational, no more banter, or it's actually way too much banter on the other side and less about the work. They kind of dissocialize a little bit in terms of, hey, maybe I'm going to go to the car and sleep, or I have to run errands during my lunch. I'm no longer spending time with my colleagues. So they're fully checking out essentially, even though everything does seem like it's okay from a work perspective. And then lastly, number 7, this is the emotional shift that you will see within a particular employee. They are either too happy because they already decided to leave. They feel relief. They're no longer feeling the pressure of the job, or they're too frustrated. They're testing if you're going to fix anything. It's kind of your last chance as a manager to address it and really change something for them. They're too flat, aka they're emotionally gone but are going through the motions. Everybody thinks they're okay. Maybe their work output has dropped slightly, but they are checking out, and that's obviously a time to check in with them and see, hey, have you actually, is something going on in your personal life? Is it work related? Again, those have to be very personal conversations, to be honest. And at that point, you have to trust your gut as a manager. You have to ask those open-ended questions. It can't just say, are you okay? Yes, no, like that's superficial, walking in the door, just saying hi to somebody. You really need to kind of understand the thought process behind that emotional shift that an employee has. Okay, so I mentioned it a little bit earlier in how do you address some of these things as a manager. So what most managers are asking in one-on-ones is, how's the project going? Are there any blockers? What can I do to help you with that? And that's essentially just a status update, right? There's no real context to things. It's not a retention conversation. Again, you have to understand the signs that are there for you to have that retention conversation versus just a status update on a project. But you really have to change your mind frame of what you're asking and what information you're trying to actually understand from your employee. So here's what actually works, right? In those conversations, and you have to do this quarterly. You can't just do it once a year because there's a lot of things that happen throughout a year. But, check in quarterly and ask some of these things. On a scale from 0 to 10, how excited are you to come to work right now? What would make it a 10? A number really forces some kind of honesty. The what would make it a 10 is really where the truth is going to live of whatever is going on for that employee at that time. If they say it's an 8 but can't articulate what a 10 would look like, it's probably a 5. Number 2, what's the most interesting problem you've worked on in the last month and why? If they struggle to answer, they're just bored, don't care, aren't focused, and bored people leave, obviously. So you really want to understand how they're engaging and what they're engaging in during the workplace. 3, where do you want to be in 18 months? Role-wise, what skills do you want to build? That is actually really going to drive what we talked about before in terms of compensation and in career growth. But if somebody cannot draw a line from today to the future, they'll find somebody who can. If you say, we'll figure it out, you just failed the test, because it's not about that. It's really trying to get deeper into what skills, how you're going to implement, creating that plan, seeing it through, more importantly, and doing the check-ins for those actual skill set building that they're trying to do. We move on to, is there something about the job that feels unfair or unbalanced right now, right? Going back to Jamie, it felt unfair that she could not hire anybody, but another team was able to, right? So it wasn't necessarily that the budget wasn't there, it just wasn't there for her. So this creates that permission for that employee to be truthful about whatever is going on. Unfairness is a top 3 resignation driver. For most candidates, there's something that feels unfair within their job, if it's not, money related or something else. But if they say, no, there's nothing that feels bad right now, you have to push. You can't just say, oh, really everything is going great. Even small things, what's bugging you can give you a little bit of a hint of what that employee is actually thinking at that time period. And then we move on to number 5 and the last one. And this is, what would make you consider leaving? And be honest. It's a really scary question for a manager to ask, but it's one of the only ones that is going to get you some real intel on what that that employee is actually thinking. They obviously won't answer it completely truthfully to 100% unless you have that sort of relationship with that person. They're going to give you something. If they give you fluff, you know that they're essentially not being honest with you, that you probably already lost them. So you want to frame it. I want to make sure I'm addressing it or addressing things that have become real deal breakers for you. That way they feel that you're actually doing something about their concerns for them specifically, not necessarily for the company. So the goal isn't to trap people, to make them feel like they're being interrogated, but it is to create a relationship where they can be honest with their manager, right? And that's obviously you listening to this right now, because if they can't be honest, they're probably already mentally resigned to some degree. So it's a matter of whether you can get them back on track or whether you've lost them forever. Okay, so obviously people resign all the time. It happens, but here's the next thing, an error that a lot of managers, kind of do sometimes, and that's they make a counteroffer. They basically look at what offer somebody got and they basically match it or give them a little bit more. But and this actually happened in Alex's case, where they gave him they basically offered him a 20% raise to bring him back up to market, instead of just the promise of a promotion during the next cycle. But Alex basically said, I appreciate it, but already accepted an offer, I'm leaving. And there's a couple things that obviously happen in Alex's head at that point, but most candidates, they're looking at this and they've thought about it before they've actually put in their resignation. And that's really saying, if I got a counteroffer, that means they could have paid me the entire time, but they just elected not to. So there's already some kind of resentment towards the company because they didn't step up throughout the time that they had with that person. But it's not always necessarily, obviously, just compensation. When it's a career path, again, you had time to fix those things and you didn't. The, Harvard Business Journal says that there's, a 50 to 80% chance that a counteroffer doesn't work and that the employee ends up leaving within 6 months of accepting a counteroffer. Again, we go back to what we've talked about on this episode, and there's signs, there's things that are going on in the background as an employee is working for you. But if none of that is addressed and you think it's just going to happen at that counter offer kind of stage, once they put in a resignation, it's just not realistic. They've been harboring some feelings for a long time. They've gone through different stages throughout that period to get them to where they ultimately landed. So, those things have to be addressed in terms of your counteroffer. I will say counteroffers can work if compensation is truly the only thing that that particular employee is looking for. Then it can work. It is rare that compensation is the only driver, but if it is, a counteroffer can obviously work. Now, it also matters when you present a counteroffer. Is it quickly within 24 hours from when that candidate told you, or is it the last day before they're supposed to start a new job? Those things matter in that as well. So if you can genuinely address an issue, and if it's only one issue with a counteroffer, then that can be successful. But again, most of the time, counter offers don't work, at least not long term. They might be a Band-Aid that you cover up for a couple months, but you're going to have to face the same issues a few months down the line. So at this point, you're probably thinking, this might be happening on my team. Here's what you need to do. In the next 24 hours, look at your calendar. When's the last time you had a one-on-one with each direct report? If it's been a while, put something on the books. Identify who hasn't had a comp review in the last 12 plus months. Think about who you've taken for granted because they're low maintenance, they're not bringing up issues, and talk to them. So this week, this is what you have to do. Schedule 45-minute one-on-ones, not 30, not hours, with your top 3 performers. Ask at least 2 hard questions that get them to be truthful about what's going on and what we discussed before. 3, listen to what they're saying. Listen to what they're not saying, just as importantly. The pauses, the hesitations. Later on this month, go ahead and audit career paths for your direct reports. Can you draw a clear progression for each person? If you can't, you probably need to sit down with them and see how you can and change that up. Review compensation against the market. Call me, call another recruiter, check industry data. We just published a couple salary reviews or comp guides for tech and finance, so be sure to check those out. Create a retention plan for the people that are potential flight risks, before they start looking. Again, you have to start early. You have to be preventative about this stuff. Be proactive instead of reactive. So this quarter, what you want to do is you want to build a recognition system that isn't just annual reviews. You want to be able to check in with those people, but more importantly, you want to acknowledge them in some way that matters to them. Not everybody wants to be, admired and shown off to the entire office. Some people do, some people don't, but understand your employee and how they will like acknowledgement. Make a career development conversation, track for each person mandatory and not necessarily optional. I think one of the things where I see in terms of candidates, everybody says they want growth. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but you have to understand what that growth is. Growth is not made equal for every person. So again, sit down with that person all the time and check in and make sure you're going in the right path for them. And you really need to fix one systematic unfairness that your team has been feeling or has mentioned. Whatever that may be, it has to be addressed in some way. Don't let it sit there. Don't say we're going to address it later. Address something this quarter so they think and see the progress that is being made for them. So everything that I've mentioned is based off of conversations that we have with candidates. And again, we're recruiters, day in day, we're talking to people, we're understanding what is going on in their life professionally and what they're looking for to correctly align them with an opportunity. So, most of the candidates that we see are not necessarily hitting the apply button on job applications. It's really, it takes one phone call at the right moment and that kind of opens things up for them. So it's not necessarily they are fully active, but there's things going on that have, allowed a phone call to actually start. And most of the time it does become kind of a discovery call for both them and myself or, any of the recruiters here at Career Movement. In having those conversations with candidates, what we, do realize is they don't necessarily leave because the grass is, greener on the other side. It's because somebody's willing to water their grass and it wasn't you. So again, there are things that you can do as an employer, as a manager to, limit the opportunities for the, employees that you want to keep, but you have to understand what the signs are and you have to be proactive about addressing them. So, by the time they're telling you that they're, resigning, that happened already, a few weeks ago when they started a job search, when they got an opportunistic phone call from somebody like myself or they had a conversation with, a friend of theirs and they got connected to somebody at a different company. And that kind of starts the chain of movement and ultimately leading to, leaving the workplace. Again, if somebody calls your employee and they're willing to take a phone call, something's going on. I can tell you that your top performers are being recruited right now. They probably got a call, they got an email, they got a text. They are being recruited to some degree. The question is not, are they being recruited today? It's, if they are being recruited today, how are they actually answering? And what are they actually telling that person on the other line? Is it, I'm happy, I'm not looking? Fantastic, that's great. But again, what are they saying? Are they just saying not interested in one particular thing? Or are they saying, actually, there might be something that can make me look? And then if that opportunity presents itself, they are going to leave. So again, the answer really depends on entirely what you do as a manager over the next 30 days, the quarter, the next year, to address some of the signs that we've talked about today. But the signs are there, everybody. Don't think they're not. They're happening. I guarantee you, and somebody like myself, a recruitment agency or a recruiter from another company is calling your people, and they are definitely trying to get them out of your place and into their walls. So step up, do what you have to do as a manager, and get yourself aligned.